Hello everyone, this is flipped video 1-4, and this one's a little bit different from the others because this one is coming from a chart of information rather than slides. A lot of this is stuff that's been talked about in other sections, but this is kind of the final little summary of all of the perspectives and approaches and kind of making sure that we fill in some gaps there. For your notes, to kind of help you to figure out which things you probably need to include the most, I've underlined some of the key words that go with each perspective, but you may also want to include anything that you hear me say that you haven't already put down in your notes before and that you find important. So let's get right into it. The first of the perspectives or approaches, those names are used interchangeably, is the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic. Now, you might be wondering, what about functionalism and structuralism? Those are considered as historical approaches and not contemporary or modern ones, so we won't really use those anymore to explain different behaviors. So psychoanalytic is sometimes called psychodynamic, and the difference between the terms is usually psychoanalytic is going with Freud's original ideas, and psychodynamic goes with the people who came after Freud, who adopted some of his ideas, but then also came up with their own different ones. So dynamic means changing, so it's sort of the changed psychoanalytic perspective. But the key person here you want to remember is obviously Sigmund Freud. He's the one who established that perspective. Carl Jung, we'll talk about him later, but he was actually one of Freud's students. And the key word here, and you probably already know this by now, is the unconscious mind, is what controls our thoughts and actions. And remember, Freud meant that as a deep layer of the mind. The key thing there is that he said that the thoughts and the memories that were in there had been pushed there through repression. And repression is something we haven't really talked about yet, and it really actually comes a little bit later in the year, is the idea that you have memories that have been pushed out of your awareness, not by your doing, but kind of on their own, that they were so traumatic that they have been pushed to where you are unaware of them. So there are repressed memories there. Let's see, and his key ways of trying to get things out of the unconscious mind were through dream analysis and word association, which we've also called free association. With each of these, we have an example of how we might try to explain a behavior using the perspective. So on our first one, or on all of these, we're going to use introversion. Introversion is when somebody is not really socially outgoing, they prefer to keep to themselves. So we're going to try to give an explanation for why a person might be introverted from each perspective. So an introverted person avoids social situations because of a repressed memory of trauma in childhood involving a social situation not consciously remembered. So perhaps they don't remember it, but maybe when they were in kindergarten, they were trying to be outgoing and then somebody made fun of them. So now they don't recall it, but they want to remain more introverted. Our next perspective is the behavioral perspective, and there's a bunch of names in this one. John B. Watson is the founder of the behaviorist perspective. Skinner is considered the most influential American psychologist of all time. Pavlov we'll get really into for conditioning, Bandura for observational learning, and then Thorndike, we'll talk about him a little bit later. The key thing here with the behavioral perspective is that we're only focusing on observable behaviors. Remember that people didn't like that Freud's information was pretty much from his own self-analysis and that he had made these things up and there was no empirical data there. So now we have this radical shift that says we only want things that we can actually see. So that's why we're going with observable behaviors in the behavioral perspective. This one says that basically everything is learned through some kind of conditioning, that you were taught a certain way. You learned it either through being rewarded or by being punished or by maybe observing it in your environment, that there's something in your environment that caused that. So introversion must be a learned behavior according to the behavioral perspective. Maybe the person was rewarded for being quiet and not interacting with others, that maybe their parents told them this is what you're supposed to do. You're quiet. You don't really get into trouble by being quiet, and we'll reward you for that. So they learned it through reward. Our next perspective is the humanist perspective, which we know was established because it felt that the first two perspectives were dehumanizing. And the person who founded that one was Abraham Maslow. The key here was it was all about helping people achieve their greatest self, their greatest potential self-fulfillment. It was all about people being able to make choices for themselves, that we have free will, but also about the idea of getting our physiological, emotional, and spiritual needs met. Maslow's hierarchy of needs ties in here, and that if you can't get your most basic needs met first, like safety, food, shelter, hunger, physiological needs, then you can't ever be self-fulfilled until you get those taken care of. This is not really an experimental type of perspective, so scientific method is hard to tie into this one, but a lot of it is used for treatments and therapy ideas. An introverted person may limit social contact with others because they find social needs are better satisfied by contact with a few close friends instead of a larger group. So they may feel that their esteem and safety needs are met best just by being introverted and only having a few friends rather than a large number of friends. All right, the next one is the evolutionary perspective, sometimes called Darwinian sociobiological, but honestly, I never call it that. And it is led by the ideas of Charles Darwin, though we don't really consider Charles Darwin to be a psychologist at all, but his ideas influence this perspective. David Buss, Alfred Kinsey, they both studied relationships, especially when it comes to finding mates or partners. So this one really looks at behavior in terms of how it relates to natural selection, that there are some psychological traits that are advantageous for survival. And really, the evolutionary perspective looks a lot at how are you going to get your genes into the next generation, pass them down to your kids, and that gene and your genes are going to survive for generations to come. So it looks a lot at choosing mates and the social behavior that goes with that. Let's see, traits that are good for survival are the ones that increase your chances for passing them down to your children. So your tendency to be extroverted is a survival advantage, making friends and allies improve the chances of survival. So this one would actually say that introversion is not necessarily a good behavior, that it's better to be extroverted because then you have more people to work with you and you have better chances of meeting somebody to get your genes into that next generation. The next perspective, I usually just call it the biological or neuroscience perspective. I didn't highlight or underline any of the specific names here. We will talk about all of these guys, but they all just did sort of like one specific big discovery in biology. So as far as if one, there's not really necessarily one name that goes with the whole perspective. But this one is really looking for biological processes that explain psychological behavior. So we're really looking at the brain and how genes and hormones and neurotransmitters, which are chemicals in the brain, explain behavior. And it's because of so much of the modern technology today that we're really able to kind of get a much better understanding of this perspective. This one would tie into genes for the explanation. A person's tendency toward introversion may be inherited from their parents, and the genes' effect on the abundance of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. We don't really think of introversion too much to be something that's inherited, but it could be. And if we're trying to tie it into biological perspective, we can say that, yeah, there could be something about introversion that maybe is genetic, though that's probably more likely a learned behavior. The cognitive perspective is our next one. And remember, we said cognitive is our fancy word for thinking. Lots of names in this one. Jean Piaget is probably the first big name. Noam Chomsky, Elizabeth Loftus for memories. But this one really looks at thought, but also memory processing and perception. But it's all about why we think and behave the way we do. And it's really just trying to understand, again, like what is our mental process in coming up with the decisions about our behavior. If we're trying to explain extroversion or introversion, a lot of it might be about how they interpret a social situation. Do you interpret others' offers for conversation as important ways to get to know someone, or important for his or her own life in some way? So basically, just do they interpret it as valuable or not? Our next one is the sociocultural perspective or social cultural. Paul Ekman, we'll talk about him. He did a lot of study about facial, universal, like worldwide facial expressions. Hans Selye did a lot of studies on stress and the environment. But this perspective is very much on the environmental or nurture side of things, that your behaviors and traits are learned from your own culture. And that could include your race, your gender, your social class, your religion, any element of culture. So shared values, customs, beliefs, those are what influence the way we act. So if we're relating extroversion here, extroversion is examined by looking at a culture's rules about social interaction. So all the things about like the distance we keep from people in while we're having a conversation. Do we touch their shoulder? Is it more important to be part of a group versus an individual? Like in collectivist versus individualist cultures, and that stuff kind of ties in here to the social cultural perspective. And finally, the last one is not really a perspective. It's just the idea that the psychological perspectives are eclectic, which means there's really, in most cases, there's multiple ways that we can explain a behavior, and we can use multiple perspectives to explain that behavior. So we use various perspectives depending on which point of view fits best with the explanation. So for example, some psychological disorders can be explained both through biological explanations, but also through learned behaviors, whereas other ones may be completely a learned behavior. So it really just depends. So psych takes that eclectic point of view. All right, these are things that we'll really be talking about and applying all year. That's why we spend so much time on them here at the beginning. That's it for Flipped 1-4.